one, but I think an important and interesting different angle. We have Gabriel Hall again here. Now I've got a picture of Lord Dalhousie. It's actually him in 1832. Oh, what? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so, I mean, I was included in this project, the Lord Dalhousie Project on Lazy Slavery, as a generalist who would be a kind of a sounding board for the lead author of the group. But as the project went on and I had a little bit more time in my hand, we had that wonderful, you know, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail moment. And I saw the tax history angle in this story. But that's not to say that the sort of the attitudes that Fu was exploring and that were clear in the correspondence between Dalhousie and Bathurst weren't important. Dalhousie clearly expressed the pro-slavery view that enslaved Africans could not be good, modern, liberal economic actors. They weren't, that, you know, freeing them from slavery wasn't going to benefit them or the sugar industry. You know, for him, every evidence that he could see that confirmed this thesis was, you know, confirming his view that slavery was something perhaps that could be made more Christian and benevolent, but not in itself a bad system. And that meant, as our report shows, that he participated in some cases led decision-making that was, you know, unequal as between two classes of the disbanded soldiers and the refugees with respect to the emission of food rations. So it's another part of that story of colonial administrators wielding food as a source of power. So that's really clear that that's there. And the report also reflects on the opportunity cost of funding a college, when in this rather poor marginal colony there were settlers, both black and white, who were in deep trouble. So both of those attitude things are an important part, but I want to concentrate, because tax history, on the numbers here and why these are cultural in some sense. So, for, the magnitudes aren't particularly important. I just want you to see that that this bar represents the money that came from the province, and the part that's blue is about the money spent on the building, Dalhousie College, main expenditure. This column is the money that came from something called the Castine Fund, which I will explain in a minute. And that went partly to the building and partly into the endowment. And this represents the total expenditure on Dalhousie College between 1818 and 1823, which was largely on the building. Dalhousie College was finished and supposedly up and ready to go in 1824, but it operated only intermittently. And in the 1840s, when it was really not, it couldn't keep faculty, the Board of Governors decided, we'll go to the merchants of Halifax and we'll get an infusion of new money and really make this a going thing. Not a cent is recorded in the records of the university. The merchants of Halifax were happy to give some money to King's, the Anglican school, but they were not supporting Dalhousie. So what you get here then, second thing to notice, so there's no private money here. There's no wealthy businessmen selling enslaved people, generously giving out of the proceeds of the West Indies trade. But the second thing that these numbers show us is that there are two pots of money, both of which are tax money. There's much made. There's a monument, a historical plaque on the Dalhousie campus that says, Castine Fund, source of the founding of endowment of Dalhousie College. And the Castine Fund was money acquired when the British occupied eastern Maine. during the War of 1812. They were headquartered at the port of Castine, and the Castine Customs House was taken over by the occupying forces. And so all of the customs revenue that was collected at Castine flowed into British coffers. And Chris Ryan here helped me by taking the Colonial Office record of that on microfilm and turning it into something legible, with many manipulations of the image. And I turned it into a lovely spreadsheet and discovered that in the context of other research that, as you can see, the Castine funding is considerably less than the provincial funding in the composition of the endowment of the expenditures on Dalhousie College. But both the Castine Fund, which was about £12,000 in Halifax currency at the time, and the provincial contribution to the college, both of those were piles of tax money collected at customs ports. And what's cultural in this? Well, British North America in the early 19th century was, to an extraordinary extent, dependent on trade taxes, customs duties, excise duties. That kind of tax spared the British government from spending more than it was already spending to keep these marginal colonies afloat. It also protected the colonists themselves from having to pay direct taxes. And Lord Dalhousie, in a document that I just recently found, it's not reflected in the report, was scathing about the property classes who composed the members of the elected members of the House and the Council that ran the affairs of the colony, because they would not levy taxes on their own property. These were states that, given the kinds of tensions there had recently been about the taxation of Britain's colonies in North America, these were places where there was a kind of a view that life was so hard that really any direct tax was an unfair burden. And in the calculation of what it would cost to collect, what it would cost to enforce, the choices were made to rely on these trade taxes that were paid in little pieces and bits in the price of the basic goods that everyone in the colony used: molasses, rum, sugar, coffee. Now, a big chunk, the largest chunk of the trade tax revenue actually came from imported goods, manufactured goods from Britain. But in the case of the Castine Fund, we know 30% of the cargoes, of the taxes paid on cargoes coming into Castine were paid on cargoes that were slave-produced goods. So that rum, that molasses, that coffee had all been grown on some extremely brutally administered plantations. The 18-teens in the Caribbean, the commodity world was not a cheerful and happy time. So these are really, in effect, kind of blood-soaked taxes. The provincial share, given the time we had and the sources we had, and I think someone could do more precise work than we did on it, but the customs reports aren't complete for the port of Halifax. But drawing on secondary research and whatever we could do at the time, about 20 to 25% of the provincial taxes that went into Dalhousie College came from taxes on molasses, rum, coffee, and sugar. So it's absolutely clear from one other interesting data point that the business model of Nova Scotia's West Indies trade depended on slavery. As you may know, the trade in slaves was ended in the British Empire in 1807, and slavery itself was abolished in 1834. The administration of it began Act 1833 in force in 1834, and finally kind of wrapped up in 1838. After 1838, what do you see in Nova Scotia in terms of those West Indies commodities, with the exception of rum, where apparently Nova Scotians had a loyalty to the British West Indies product, but with brown sugar, molasses, and coffee, 70% had previously come from the British West Indies. After the abolition of slavery, 70% came from the foreign West Indies, where, you guessed it, slavery was still practiced. So, probably anyone who grows up in Nova Scotia has a bit of an idea that there's a merchant class that grows rich on the West Indies trade. But we take that out into an understanding of really how the whole financing of the infrastructure of this nascent colony gets close to a third, between a quarter and a third of its, depending on the flows in any given year, of its revenue from taxes on slave-produced goods. The interests of Nova Scotia's merchants were firmly aligned with the slaveholders of the West Indies. Our provincial legislature was built around in the same years. It was completed in 1819, drew on some of the same trade flows for its financing. And so, you could say the very stones of our provincial legislature were paid for in part by that trade. So we don't stand entirely apart from it, simply even in these sort of physical legacies, although this particular building is now gone. So what are the two connections to the present that this bit of thinking has brought me to, and which I suggest to you for your entertainment and interest? Let's start by going back to the free rider imaginary. Our favorite free riders these days are, of course, the billionaires memorialized in this coffee mug from the Warren campaign. No one disputes that there are people of great wealth who pay extraordinarily, it seems, small amounts of tax to the public coffers. And it's deeply distressing that when great wealth exists amid suffering and from social arrangements from which wealth benefits. The point I want to make here is not to call into question the existence that there is something morally dubious, some element of free riding in our current arrangements for taxing both high income and wealth. But I do want to suggest that, as with the view that immigrants were free riders on tax in the 1930s, we should ask whether the free rider charge might be stopping us sometimes from thinking by means of slightly self-serving moralism. So some of you will have followed the wealth tax debate. As I say, the serious question is not that whether there's too low contributions made by great wealth and great income, but what amount of public revenue would be captured by various proposed measures, and what would be the costs of collecting it. If you've been following this in the United States case, where there's been two kind of high-powered groups contesting it, those who are advising Warren, Zuckman and Saez, predict 2% tax on incomes, wealth above 50 million, 1% more, wealth above 1 billion would generate between 219 billion and 275 billion a year. And you're going, okay, billions, my hand's already spinning. A little context, annual deficit of the United States government is $779 billion a year in a recent year. Their annual budget is $4.4 trillion, which you might think of as 4,407 billion. Okay, so we're talking about maybe a quarter of the annual deficit, and a smallish but not nothing amount of the annual budget might be added by the tax that they propose. Those who challenge that, Summers and Sarin, say might be an eighth of that amount. And where the disagreement comes up is how enforceable is the kind of tax proposed. What level of investment in enforcement is going to be required to deliver the results of a wealth tax? Now, it's probably above my pay grade and competency to decisively settle. I spent this afternoon reading literature on the wealth tax. I have my intuitions of what the right answer might be, or what a good answer might be. But what worries me in the ordinary politics of this is that the free rider imaginary can have this sort of blinkering effect, where, yeah, sure, wealthy taxpayers shouldn't push the system as hard as they do, and a good government should pass laws that really enable us to meet our collective objectives. Yes, yes. But what should we try to do, given the disagreements about the actual stock of wealth that exists and the level of uncertainty around what the enforcement capacity is actually going to deliver? The free rider thought, we'll just make them pay, can stop people from doing the slightly harder work that it means a little bit more engagement with numbers. You got to actually try to figure out how billions and trillions interact and what percentage of the federal budget they are, and maybe even try to grapple a little bit with how some of the tax avoidance mechanisms that would have to be countered work. So my point about the free rider imaginary is don't let it stop you from thinking about what you contribute and what other ways there might be to solve the problems that the wealth tax worthily is aimed at solving. Worthily aimed at solving campaign finance problems. It's worthily aimed at solving concentration of economic power. Worthily aimed at solving, the sort of creation of this aristocratic elite. All of these are real problems. Thinking about how to address them and whether the wealth tax is the best policy method is the thing I think that I'm asking you to contemplate, rather than just saying, I want to drink the tears of billionaires, which is a reasonable thing too in itself. But it is the kind of tribal sloganeering that discredits politics. I have my team, they have their team. I'm not interested in thinking about the question. Right? So I'm afraid free rider imaginary is at work in our own time. Okay, Laura Dalhousie makes me think about the reparations project. And this was a recent book that was put together by young African Nova Scotian kids in a children's book, an alphabet, to help educate them about what slavery has meant in Nova Scotia. It's a lovely product. Okay. I've suggested to you, I was thinking through this project, that even though the building of Dalhousie College no longer exists in its 1824 form, And the endowment, very little of it made into the endowment of the new Dalhousie that was chartered in 1863. 5% of that final endowment might have come from, in some way, the Castine or the 30% of the Castine trade. So it's not like there's a big contribution from the trade in slavery-based goods. But nonetheless, I think even knowing that is enough to unsettle a little bit the Nova Scotians' romantic, our wealth was created by, bold merchants and cunning privateers and clever sea captains, hardworking pioneers. Yeah, sure. And a lot of them were working on a business model that required the mass enslavement of African people, and that's where some of that money came from. So it should unsettle a little bit the self-congratulatory nature of Nova Scotian economic history. The ideas that Lord Dalhousie took for granted and articulated in his letters were, as I suggested, the ideological tools of slave economies. And they meant policies and behaviors in his time that hobbled at their foundation the economic efforts of those black Nova Scotians. They shaped very much the expectations in a way that we trace through histories of Nova Scotia, Thomas Aiken's History of Halifax, Thomas Riddell, Warden of the North, all of these either channel or actually quote directly Lord Dalhousie as he opines on the work ethic of the black refugees. And sometimes they ramp it right up, and each writer seems to make it worse, like the black people become more lazy and more laughable as time goes on from the original source. Dalhousie, compared to Thomas Riddell, is a positive paragon of racial tolerance. Anyway, that cultural content is a big part of what's meant by the legacy of slavery in Nova Scotia, and reparations is not necessarily forking over a chunk of money. It's ensuring that in commemoration and in elementary school and grade school education, descendants of African Nova Scotian, of the black refugees, can know that they aren't being depicted in the terms of that white supremacist slaves or formerly enslaved people are lazy and can't be made to work vocabulary. It's even there in Robin Weeks. I don't know how many of you have read Robin Weeks' Blacks in Canada. I read it long ago and I didn't see what the problem was at all. And after doing this work, I go, whoa. So there's work to do there. What the tax history piece really contributes just is that, no matter what our individual attitudes are, we enjoy benefits as white people and feel the legacy of harms as black people in Nova Scotia that are built into the economic history of the province. And based on forms of cruelty and exploitation we had no part of, we didn't see, but we get the benefits. To bring the two topics back together for my final 3 sentences, one of the reasons I turn to tax as a thing to study is that I really think that boring things that operate below the level of daily awareness are among the most powerful sources of inequality and injustice. You don't notice it, they're just too boring to pay attention to. But attitudes and beliefs such as the ones I've talked about, assumptions about normal family, about normal business practice, about normal levels of consumption, the law takes those up and makes them into institutions, sometimes heightening their impact in the way law is administered. Changing tax law is also kind of difficult, at least in some areas. Law represents hard-won trade-offs between opposed interests. So the result of this seeing history through the lens of tax is that you see a kind of inertia operating in social relations, persistently, quietly in the background. Now, in education, in medicine, in policing, historians have gone to town trying to figure out how these mechanisms of social control work, how these ways of organizing our common sense are built into us from our infancy. But unlike those institutions. Canadian tax hasn't had the historical scrutiny that it deserves as a mechanism of social organization and social control. Along with Ellsworth Heeman and David Tuff, I hope my work will help change that, and there's a lot more to do, and I invite you to join me in doing it. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 15-20 minutes for questions or suggestions or comments, and I'll let you take them in.
Okay, you mentioned for the Dalhousie case, there's this degree, which I've often heard of, that the merchants benefited from the plantation owner. Mm-hmm. And so it was in the case of Nova Scotia, and that is there a sign of the merchants in government or including government, were they equally did they also have their hands in the plantation,
So we're curious about, and we don't have enough research about the extent to which capital that was accumulated in Nova Scotian hands was then reinvested in some way in the taking up mortgages, lending money to slave owners that were secured with enslaved people as collateral. I did look into that for another project, for the Kings and Slavery project, because for the Dow project, I'm looking at a period where the culture of slavery in Nova Scotia is relatively in abeyance. There's relatively few people who privately own slaves. So I looked around, I looked in probate records, but I think there's really more to do in insurance records, in history of banking. I'm not sure, based on the kinds of probate records I found, I did find some very big, prominent government figures like Richard Bulkley, well-to-do and very influential in the colonial government. Based on what I've seen so far, my thought was that they really had a lot of opportunities to invest their land, invest their capital in Nova Scotia. They were mortgaging property. They were lending money to farmers. They were, investing in the coal fields and shipbuilding. So they kind of didn't have to take the risk of investing into going into the plantation loans, which were, that money invested in plantations was pretty unstable, as you can well imagine, in the years leading up to emancipation and afterwards. So I'm not expecting there to be a big, in terms of the legacies of British slave ownership, that database that shows the compensation records from the 1830s. We found 2 Nova Scotians who got money through investments they had in West Indies plantations. So certainly by 1834, in that important database, there wasn't any sign of it, but it could have been earlier on. Certainly there was trading going on. And, yeah, thanks.